Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm going to be reviewing the new album from Tom Morello, The Atlas Underground. Now Tom Morello is best known as the guitarist for Rage Against the Machine, also some other projects like Audio Slave, more recently that Prophets of Rage project that I covered last year when they dropped their debut album. Wasn't really a big fan of it, didn't really interest me all too much, but this is the first full-length solo album that we're getting from Tom. And of course, I was somewhat interested in checking it out, given that I am a fan of some of his previous works. Not all of them, like I just said, but, a good amount of them, I would say. So I was interested in checking this thing out, of course. And, I'm not really going to beat around the bush much longer here. This album is terrible, honestly. There's very little, if anything, on here that I could say I was able to even, tolerate, to say the least. Now, as to why this is, there's a variety of factors that play into why, but one of the most notable might come from you taking a look at the track list, in particular the features that are, present on this project. Now, of course, Tom is best known for his guitar work, so you might expect some features to pop up on this thing to really, spice things up a bit, have some vocalists in there, all that stuff. Makes sense. And some of the features on here do make a fair bit of sense. You've got some rappers, you got some singers, some rock singers. That's all fine and dandy. That's exactly what I would expect on an album from someone who was part of one of the biggest, groups that was fusing rap and rock music back in their prime. It makes sense. What didn't really make all that much sense looking at the features for this thing were a lot of the EDM artists featured on here. Now, I have nothing against EDM music. There's some of it I enjoy, but I wasn't really sure how it was going to work on this album here, given that, I would expect more of a rock or hip-hop sound from this project, especially given some of the other features on this thing. I was kind of afraid that this album was going to be just a mess of sounds, but I was still hopeful that maybe this album would pull through and somehow mix them in a way that worked, and that didn't happen. It did not mix them in a way that works. This album pretty much sounds exactly how you would expect it to sound given the feature list for this project. Like a mess of sounds, pretty much. You have elements of rock music, hip-hop, EDM, some other things as well at times, just mashed together here on this project in a way that just does not really work. Now, there are some artists that are featured on this thing that I happen to be pretty, big fans of, I would say, and that I would typically be very excited to see them featured on the track list of an album. But on this project, even from the features that I do happen to like, they don't really perform up to their usual level of quality, I guess you could say. Take, for example, Killer Mike and Big Boy on Rabbit's Revenge, or Jizza and RZA of the Wu-Tang Clan on the closing track on here. All rappers that I really like, but they all kind of underperform here on this album. Like, the verses are very forgettable in the grand scheme of all the verses that they've ever put out before. They're really just, I feel like you could have gotten like any old rapper to do some of these verses, given how they're performed, really. Not that they're, downright awful, but given how good some of these artists are, and how good of rappers they are, I expected much better from them here on this thing. There's also some features spread across here that I just find to be kind of out of place and strange in, the grander scheme of the album, I guess you could say. It really don't fall into the category of, your typical rock or hip-hop or EDM feature, I guess you could say. Like, you have the track with Marcus Mumford, which is just this kind of odder detour in the track listing, or the track with Portugal the Man was another one that felt really out of place on here, even given just how mashed together all the sounds on this thing sound. Those tracks still sound particularly out of place, given that their features are a bit odder compared to a lot of the other ones on here. And then for the EDM features that are on this thing, oh boy, they're easily the weakest point of this project. And once again, I got nothing really against EDM or any of the artists in particular featured here on this thing. It's just the combination of sounds here just does not work. Lots of times what you end up getting on this project is like a more typical verse that you would expect with, like a rapped verse, a sung verse, just some guitar part from Tom. And then, there'll be some dubstep drop in the middle of the track, which, Nothing against dubstep. There's some dubstep out there that's good that I like, but it sounds really out of place on this project, given the fact that it's a Tom Morello album, given some of the other features on this thing, given the fact that dubstep hasn't really been relevant in a good few years at this point. It's kind of a dated sound at this point, and it makes this album just seem all that much stranger in the grand scheme of things. I mean, I gave Fall Out Boy a ton of flack for Young and Menace and how that track kind of took some dubstep influences and just made a really awful song with it. But at least they had the decency to only do that on one track on their newest album. Whereas here, it's a good amount of the tracks are like that, which is, kind of a shame because I don't really understand why was this done necessarily. I mean, it's not really a really interesting fusion of like rap rock and EDM. It's just like these two worlds being mashed together uncomfortably until it just doesn't like work. One of the worst just fusions of like this dubstep sound with everything else really is the track How Long, that features Steve Aoki doing the EDM influences and also features the vocalist from Rise Against on the vocals here. And this pretty much plays out like what happened, I feel, if Rise Against decided to make a dubstep song pretty much. It's not good in the slightest. You just have this very like aggressive like drop going throughout this thing. It just feels really strange. And I know I keep saying that a lot because so much of this album just feels like it was pulled from like 2011 or something when this type of music was really popular. Like I could expect this album having been made then. Like had this come out in 2011 or 2012, it wouldn't have been a good album still, but at least I could have understood it a bit more. But like in 2018, like who is this album appealing to? And this track is just so painful to listen to. Easily one of my least favorites in the track listing. The opening track on here, Battle Sirens, is one that honestly starts off not awful. Like, the guitar parts that Tom is doing at the beginning of this track aren't anything to write home about necessarily, but it's not awful either. And yet then, you have this really obnoxious drop that comes in later on, and it just kind of, what I felt then on my first listen was pretty much my mood for this, listening to this project going forward. Just a ton of disappointment and just confusion, really. The track Roadrunner is another one on here that I'm not really feeling all that much, though honestly there isn't a track on here I think I am. But this one in particular, it features an artist by the name of Lake Kelly 47, unfamiliar with who that is, but wasn't really a big fan of their feature on this track. I will say that their performance at least is able to match like the energy of the more aggressive sound that Tom has going with his guitar work, but that's really all I can compliment it on. The performance just feels really forced, a bit over the top, and just kind of ruins any sort of seriousness I had while listening to it. And believe me, there was not much seriousness that I had by this point in the album's run. I felt like this album could really throw anything at me by this point in the track listing, and I was willing to accept it. And, up to this point in the review, you might have noticed that I've mostly been talking about the features. I haven't really been talking about Tom himself and his contributions to the album. And that's mostly because his presence on this album isn't really all that strong. I mean, don't get me wrong. He'll definitely pop up every so often providing some guitar parts. And of course his guitar parts are pretty recognizable because they have that signature sound of his to them. But they're not really super interesting, at least to me. Like, I've heard him do much better guitar work on many previous projects he's put out. The riffs on here just are kind of bland overall. I will say that they're probably some of the stronger points on this project, but even that isn't all that much. Really, it just kind of seems like he had an interest in all these different artists from all these different genres and wanted to put them all on like one album together, so he like assembled them all up and then just provided some like basic guitar parts to sort of tie everything together. Really, what this album ends up feeling like is like that dubstep Korn album, like mixed with a DJ Khaled album. Like if it had the attitude of a DJ Khaled project, that's kind of what this album is, and that's not a good thing. The lyrics on this project are many times political, which is something that you would expect given the artist involved with this thing. Of course, Rage Against the Machine very political group, and lots of the artists featured on this thing are known for their politics as well. Artists like, the beforehand mentioned Killer Mike or Rise Against, for example. It's really no surprise that the lyrics on this thing are political, but they're just so surface level and uninteresting. It's like going over just the very basics of lots of the problems in the world today. They don't really focus in on any particular details all that much. It's just a lot of the same stuff that you've probably heard before, probably from these very same artists on their own work, but probably better there. It just makes this project feel overall really underbaked when it comes to the lyrics. Like, they had ideas clearly, but they just didn't develop them to any point where they're actually interesting. And given that the performances on here tend to be pretty underwhelming as well, it doesn't make for very compelling listening overall. None of the lyrics really hooked me or compelled me all that much. None of the rapping or the singing did. The instrumentation certainly did not for the most part. Really, this project is just, definitely the strangest album I've heard this year. Probably one of the strangest albums I've heard in recent memory. But also easily, at least as of now, and hopefully for the rest of the year, I don't hear anything worse than this, but this is probably the worst album I've heard this year thus far. I just see, nothing in this project worth returning to. There was, nothing in this thing that I enjoyed at all, not even, in the slightest. The best parts of this project are when it's just being really boring and uninteresting. Like, some of the guitar work on here, some of the rapping, it might not be downright awful, but it's still uninteresting. But those are still the highlights for this project. The low points for the project are even worse. You have some really bad mixtures of a variety of different genres. Usually, of course, rock, hip-hop, EDM, just being mixed in a way that doesn't really show any understanding of how these genres would work nicely together if they were to be mixed. These genres could be mixed together nicely for sure, but this isn't really the way to do it. It's just mashing sounds together and trying to see what sticks pretty much. And nothing is really sticking here. And it's just such a confusing record as well. Why this ended up sounding the way it did, I just don't really understand. Like I said, I understand the rap features. I understand the rock features. Even some of the other stranger features on here, like the Portugal the Man feature or the Mumford feature, those could make sense in some regard. But why they decided to then bring EDM into this as well, I have no idea, because I feel like that's easily one of the strangest things about this thing. It just makes the album sound really dated as well, despite the fact that it, literally just came out. So yeah, I did not like this project one bit, honestly. Though that is just my own personal opinion. I wouldn't recommend this album to anyone. Even if morbid curiosity compels you to listen to this thing just to hear how bad it is, honestly, it's really not worth it. Just to look at the track list and the features will tell you what this thing is going to sound like pretty much. And if you're really curious to know what it sounds like if you just need to hear at least something from it, listen to the Steve Aoki Rise Against track. That one is, that should explain everything to you rather, succinctly, at least compared to listening to the album in full. But yeah, I wouldn't recommend this album. Yeah, didn't enjoy it. If you happen to enjoy it for whatever reason, that's perfectly okay. In fact, feel free to leave a comment below as to why that is. Or if you happen to agree with me, comment down below why you felt that way. Leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, all that stuff. Yeah, I don't know what to say with this album, guys, honestly. It's really something. I will say that it's definitely one of the more interesting albums I've heard this year, even if it is also one of the worst. So yeah, at least yeah. Thanks for watching. Stay golden. What else am I gonna say?